The issue we're running into around COVID specifically is that we were not scientific in our approach. So we didn't run randomized control trials. We don't know. The data doesn't exist anymore, and we've confounded the data set, so we can't even run the trials today to figure out what we don't know, because we've totally confounded the data set.
Last question, then I'll let you get to your revolving door.
Yeah.
So let's say you're talking about whether it's the COVID vaccine or whether it's vaccines and autism and other sorts of things. You get people who are tribal, on all of those things, and maybe you would agree with tribalism when it comes to the vaccine and autism link, because that seems like something that's a little bit more clear. But
okay.
How would you let's say
you're
talking.
Again, there's a difference between this being, a broad population effect and this potentially being an individual, adverse event. I mean, we both have an aunt who, potentially suffered vaccine side effects from, I believe it was the polio vaccine.
Right.
And, so I don't know if that actually happened or not, but there's at least a reason to suspect it and to, to potentially explore that. And so it's interesting when, people who are very aware of that situation, are blind to, the potential for vaccine side effects in a novel vaccine, much less, one from years ago. And it's interesting too when we look at the data. So I'll back up a little bit and then sort of frame most of this with the statement that the issue we're running into around COVID specifically is that we were not scientific in our approach. So we didn't run randomized control trials. We don't know. The data doesn't exist anymore, and we've confounded the data set, so we can't even run the trials today to figure out what we don't know, because we've totally confounded the data set with the approaches that we took that were fundamentally unscientific. So rather than running studies to see which intervention in a randomized control manner actually are, better or worse, what the safety effects are, we didn't require that. We just did a population level study without a control group. And that is just, it's appalling from a scientific standpoint. So we just don't have good data now, and you can basically say anything you want, and nobody can prove you wrong around certain sort of positions about COVID and vaccinations, et cetera, because the data is just not good because we didn't bother to collect it. So I'm not going to take a one side or the other, except to say we were unscientific in our approach, and I don't think there's any question about that. And that I hold against the regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies should have been more scientific in their approach and less driven by fear of what was happening, because then we would have actually had information to drive future decision making. But instead, we had years of very little, if any, good information, followed by population level interventions, again, without good information. And so it's like we have not learned from our mistakes. And most of the people who were in charge of those agencies and making those decisions are not the kind of people we need running scientific agencies. Like that's like fundamental number one. You want people running scientific agencies who are scientifically minded and are actually going to take the steps needed so that we can have the information to make good decisions in the future.
And you don't want politicians and bureaucrats running scientific agencies?
Generally not.
Okay.
And yeah, and that is very much what what it's gotten to. And this is back to, again, this sort of tribalism that we have at the moment, which is, agencies that are coming out and making statements that are not driven by science. They're not driven by scientific evidence. They're driven by a particular tribal opinion and perspective. Yeah, and it could have gone the other way. Like,
So how do you deal with that in conversation? You have people who, they get their 5-year-old vaccinated when they're completely healthy. They're not around anybody uh, who's
they,
susceptible.
they
And
probably already had
and
some level of natural immunity at that point. I mean, the
well, but
number
at the same
of
time,
school age children who had it based on titers. I mean, when we go and look at who's had it and been exposed, just about everybody at this point, has already been, exposed, and most of those that are children were exposed naturally and developed some kind of natural immunity. So, and I'll continue with this other point. The problem with not having data is that, so there's some population level information that's come out about the overall let's say, excess deaths, risk of mortality, right, in various populations. So those who weren't vaccinated, those who got in the U.S. and in other countries it'll vary, but in the U.S. the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, which is more of a traditional vaccine, and then the mRNA vaccines. And what we've seen is that the risk of dying in the Johnson and Johnson vaccinated population is less than in the unvaccinated group. And the risk of dying in the mRNA vaccinated group overall is higher. But the problem is you can't just even take that at face value, because who would have fallen into each of these groups is different. And so their basic level of risk on a population within these cohorts that have self-selected, it may not be that the mRNA vaccine is any more dangerous than the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. It may just be more vulnerable. More vulnerable people were more likely to get that vaccination. We don't even know at this point. It's really tough to parse the data, looking back. And smarter people than I are exploring this and chasing it and trying to make heads or tails of a lot of this excess death data. But I just point to it to say we fundamentally don't know the things we ought to know. If we had approached this much more scientifically from the beginning, we would already have the answers. People wouldn't have to go try to do some, obtuse statistical analyses to try to figure out, what's the better approach, what should have we done. On top of which is, even if that data does come out, I'm fairly convinced, based on how people have operated, that people aren't going to change their minds about what decision they made. Most people are going to double down that what I did was the right thing, and everybody else are a bunch of morons for not doing exactly what I did. And my view is what you should do in an individual circumstance is going to vary. And I probably can't tell you one way or the other what you should do. Though, I have a framework for how I would deal with that in different cases. And it's mostly based on sort of the risk benefit and trying to overall reduce the risk that you're exposing yourself to. And there's certain circumstances where, getting the vaccinations is probably a higher risk, especially if you're getting boosted. Like, we know that for certain young men, the more boosters you get, the higher the likelihood is that you're getting certain sort of heart related issues. And so, it's gonna be very nuanced and depend on the particular, situation. And then I see, blatant lies come out, about the data that we know. There were, I believe it was animal studies, but, we saw in certain animal studies that the spike proteins accumulated in ovaries, which means that there are certain risks for women that are probably higher than men, because we didn't see a similar, kind of, effect for testicles, for testes, for instance. So, there's just like, and whenever people are fact checking these statements, there's like an obfuscation. Like, this is the thing I've noticed looking at news and looking at fact checking. They have a side that they want to be on, and then they fact check the argument they don't like and find the narrow way in which it's either true or false to fit their narrative, as opposed to talk about how it's true and false, narrative aside. And this is, it's the thing that drives me nuts about just about everybody involved has a side they're trying to tip the scale towards. And maybe that's always been true, but